There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all from the outside. It looks like a man in a waiter's vest leaning down quietly beside a woman at a dinner table, his hand cupped near his mouth, his voice low enough that only she can hear. It looks like the smallest possible gesture. It looks to anyone watching from across the room like nothing more than a server delivering a message about the evening's specials. What it actually was, on that particular Thursday evening in the private dining room of Hartwell's on 5th, was a man risking the only stable thing he had left, his job, his income, the thing that kept the lights on and his daughter in her school and the refrigerator reasonably full, because he spoke a language that the woman at the table didn't know he spoke. And what he'd heard in that language had made it impossible for him to stay quiet. His name was James Calloway. He was 43 years old, a waiter at Hartwell's for going on 6 years, a father of one, a girl named Rosie, 11, who did her homework at the small table near the service station on the nights. James worked late because the after-school program ended at 6 and his shift didn't end until 9 and there was no one else. The maître d' had long since stopped, pretending not to know about the homework table. He'd even once brought Rosie a slice of the pastry chef's trial run of a new dessert, which Rosie had accepted with the grave and considered appreciation of a child who understood that kindness should be received properly. James had been a translator once. That was the life before this life. Graduate degree in linguistics, fluent in 4 languages, working for an international consulting firm that sent him to places most people only read about, back when he was young and certain and unencumbered. Then his wife had gotten sick, and then she had gotten sicker, and then she was gone. And James had come home from his last assignment to a 3-year-old who needed a father who was present and a career that required a father who was always somewhere else. And the choice had been no choice at all, really. He didn't regret it. That was the thing he wanted people to understand when they found out, as they occasionally did, about the degrees and the languages and the life that used to be. He didn't regret it. Rosie was worth every translation he'd never done, but he kept the languages the way you keep anything that was once fundamental to who you were, quietly, privately, occasionally taking them out and turning them over just to confirm they were still there. French, German, Italian, and Mandarin, which he'd spent 3 years learning and which most people, looking at James Calloway, the waiter, the widower, the man in the black vest carrying water glasses in a fine restaurant, would never have suspected he knew at all, which was, on that particular Thursday evening, precisely the problem. The woman at table 7 was named Sophia Brennan. James knew this because Hartwell's was that kind of restaurant. The kind where the staff were briefed on significant guests before service, not intrusively but sufficiently. Sophia Brennan, 41, founder and CEO of Brennan Capital, in town for what the reservation. Notes described simply as a business dinner of significance. She was dressed in white, which stood out in the warm amber lighting of the private room the way white always stands out. Not conspicuously, but unmistakably. She had the composed and watchful quality of someone who had been in enough important rooms to know how to inhabit them without effort. The man across from her was being introduced, per the same briefing notes, as her potential partner in a significant overseas acquisition, a transaction that, from the numbers James had overheard referenced in passing before service began, was in the range of several $100 million. He was accompanied by his own team, 3 people arranged around the table with the careful positioning of people who knew their roles, and by a translator, a man in his mid-50s, silver-haired, whose name James had not caught, who sat to Sophia's left and whose job it was to carry the evening's conversation across the language barrier between the two parties. James had noticed the translator early in the service. It was a habit from his old life. When you speak a language, you notice other people speaking it, the way a musician notices someone else's technique. He'd refilled water glasses, delivered the first course, moved through the room with the practiced invisibility that good service requires, and listened, the way he always half-listened, to the ambient sound of the room around him. And then, somewhere between the first course and the second, he heard something that made him set down the water pitcher on the service station and stand very still for a moment. The translator was not translating what the man across the table was saying. Not entirely, not accurately. It was subtle. That was what made it dangerous. A careless lie is easy to catch. This was not careless. The translator was rendering most of the conversation faithfully, enough that Sophia had no reason to doubt him, enough that the rhythm and texture of the exchange felt correct. But in the specifics that mattered, there were omissions, adjustments, small alterations that changed the shape of what was being agreed to, without changing the surface appearance of the conversation. The man across the table had said in Mandarin a sentence that translated accurately as, "The equity distribution in the secondary agreement will not reflect the terms discussed in the preliminary documents. Our legal team has confirmed this is binding once signed." The translator had rendered this as, "He says the equity distribution will be consistent with your preliminary discussions, and he looks forward to finalizing the terms." James stood at the service station for a long moment after that. He refilled a glass he didn't need to refill. He straightened a napkin on a tray. He did the things a man does when he is deciding something important and trying to look like he is, deciding nothing at all. Rosie needed the job. That was the fact he kept returning to, the weight on one side of the scale. 6 years at Hartwell's, a manager who worked with his schedule, a maitre d' who pretended not to see the homework. Table, health care, stability, the kind of predictable, reliable income that a single father builds his child's sense of security on. On the other side of the scale was a woman in white who was about to sign something that would cost her. James didn't know exactly how much, but enough that the word several preceded the word hundred preceded the word million, because the man sitting across from her had brought his own translator for precisely this reason. James thought about his daughter, not as a reason to stay quiet, as a reason to speak. Rosie was 11 years old and had her mother's directness and her father's habit of doing the inconvenient right thing. She would not, James knew with certainty, want the lights on and the refrigerator full and her school paid for at the cost of a woman being quietly defrauded across a dinner table while her father stood 12 feet away and said nothing. He picked up the water pitcher. He walked to table 7. He refilled Sophia Brennan's glass, which did not need refilling, and he leaned down, his hand cupped near his mouth, and he said very quietly, in a voice designed to carry no further than her ear, "Ms. Brennan, I'm going to ask you to trust me for 30 seconds. Your translator is not giving you accurate renderings of what's being said. The equity terms being discussed are materially different from what's being translated. I'd strongly recommend you not sign anything this evening until you've had the documents reviewed independently." He straightened up, refilled the glass of the man to Sophia's right, who had noticed nothing, set the pitcher down on his tray, looked at Sophia once briefly, with the calm and steady eyes of a man who has said what he came to say and will accept whatever comes next, and walked back to the service station. Sophia Brennan was, among other things, a woman who had built a significant enterprise by knowing when to trust her instincts, and her instinct in that moment, looking at the waiter's face, at the absolute absence of performance in it, at the quality of stillness in a man who had just done something that could cost him considerably, was that he was telling the truth. She didn't make a scene. She was far too composed for scenes, and far too intelligent to tip her hand to the people across the table before she understood the full shape of what she was dealing with. She simply set down her pen, which she had been about to pick up, and said pleasantly that she would like a few minutes before signing, as she wanted to review one section of the document, and would anyone like more wine in the meantime, because the Sancerre had been really quite lovely. The man across the table smiled, with the confidence of someone who had not yet noticed that the ground had shifted, and said yes, he would love more wine. James brought the wine. He did not look at Sophia. She did not look at him. After dinner, after the other party had left with handshakes and pleasantries, and the unsigned documents tucked under an arm, with what James thought looked like only slightly concealed frustration, Sophia sat alone at the table for a moment, her wine glass in her hand, the white roses in the center of the table going soft in the low light. She asked the maitre d' to bring the waiter who had served table 7. James came to the table still in his vest, his notepad in his pocket. The way a man comes when he's been summoned and isn't sure of the reception. He stood at a professional distance, the way service staff stand. "Sit down," Sophia said. Not unkindly, just directly. James sat. "How do you know Mandarin?" she asked. He told her. Not the whole story, not immediately, but the shape of it, the degree, the consulting work, his wife, Rosie, the homework table in the corner by the service station. He told it the way he always told it when he told it at all. Plainly and without self-pity, because it was simply what had happened and he had long since made his peace with what had happened and the peace was genuine. Sophia listened without interrupting. She was good at listening. It was, she would have said herself, probably the skill that had built more of her success than any other single thing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You knew you could lose your job," she said. "Yes," James said. "Why did you do it?" James thought about Rosie at the homework table, about her mother's directness, about the right thing being the right thing even when it was the inconvenient thing. "My daughter," he said, "would have known if I hadn't." Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her wine glass and tilted it slightly toward him, the small, precise gesture of a woman who has decided something. "I want to offer you a position," she said. "Director of International Liaison. It's what you trained for, essentially, and I have significant need of someone who speaks the languages you speak and has the character you've just demonstrated." She paused. "It would require some travel, but nothing that couldn't be arranged around a school schedule. I have a daughter of my own. I understand how the schedule works." James was quiet for a moment. He looked around the room, at the white tablecloths, at the amber lighting at the corner by the service station where Rosie's homework table sat empty tonight, because it was Thursday, and Thursday she was at her friend Nora's house. "I'd need to think about it," he said. "Of course," Sophia said. "Take the time you need." She did one more thing before she left that evening. She found the maître and told him that James Calloway was not to face any professional consequences for what had happened at Table 7. She said it in the tone of someone accustomed to being understood on the first attempt, and the maître nodded, and that was that. James took the position. He told Rosie about it on a Friday evening, over dinner at their small kitchen table with the homework, pushed to one side the way it always was on Fridays. Rosie listened to the whole story. The translator. The dinner, the pen, not yet picked, up, with the focused attention of a child who knows when her parent is telling her something important. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was thinking something through properly. "You could have lost your job," she said. "I could have," James agreed. "But you didn't." "No." Rosie considered this. "Because you did the right thing," she said. Not as a question. As a conclusion she'd arrived at and was confirming. "That's how I'd put it," James said. Rosie nodded slowly, with the gravity of a person filing something important away for future use. Then she picked up her fork and returned to her dinner, and the kitchen was quiet and warm and full of the small sounds of an ordinary Friday evening, which was, James thought, one of the finest sounds he knew. He had spent years carrying languages that nobody knew he carried. He had spent years being more than what the vest and the notepad suggested, without needing anyone to know it. What he knew, and had always known, and would spend the rest of his life teaching his daughter, was that what you carry doesn't matter nearly as much as what you do with it when the moment comes, and that the moment when it comes is always quieter than you expect. Just a man leaning down beside a table, his voice low enough for one person to hear, saying the true thing because the true thing needed saying. That's all courage ever really is when you look at it plainly. Just that.